can you please share your name?
My name is Councilman Amilcar Hernandez. My earliest memories of library. Let's go back to Puerto Rico. I mean, that's where I was born. That's where I mostly grew up. I went to school in Puerto Rico all the way until 9th grade. So essentially for me, libraries were mostly in schools. I didn't have access to libraries the way that I see that we have access to libraries in our community here, especially in Hartford. But in Puerto Rico, there were some libraries in the community, but very scarce, and they were not as attractive. But the libraries in the schools, those were amazing. So it was like a very strange thing for me. But libraries for me were extremely important, especially because there were some parts of my elementary school years that I was a little bit, I want to say shy in a way. And the libraries were the place where I was able to express myself in many different ways. Not only I was into history, and I'm still into history. I love encyclopedias, and I remember this 4-volume encyclopedia set about the history of Puerto Rico that even at the early age of 7, 8 years old, I started reading them. My family couldn't afford to buy that set, and it was all over the TV all the time. Buy this encyclopedia set. But for me, it was like I need a few minutes in the library so I could keep reading about this encyclopedia because we couldn't afford to buy it. So for me, it was important the library because that's how I engage into the reading. My imagination and my creative side of it started growing, and it was quiet. It was a safe place for me. I didn't have to deal with some of the social nuances that I have that I felt that I was not comfortable with. As I grew older, I totally changed. I was very extrovert. I socialized a lot. But then libraries had a different meaning for me. Because at that point, libraries were not just a place for me to be safe and read and learn, but it was actually a true resource of information that I needed not only to do my assignments, but to also continue that path of curiosity that I've always had. So again, in Puerto Rico, it was inside the schools and they were extremely critical. And again, at that time, computers were also kind of like coming into play, early mid-90s. And it was also another layer of opportunities and another layer of curiosity. What is this? What is a computer? What is the internet? And so I was able to grow during that part of transition between hard copy books and digital information. So for me, it was important to be part of that transition, but I valued those hard copy books. You have no idea how much. I actually prefer to have hard copy books than reading them online because I feel like I'm touching it. I feel like I'm part of it. So I have a deep connection with it. You're taking me back to the North Coast. When you talk about Isabela and you talk those areas, that's where the best beaches of Puerto Rico are, right? And I am actually from that north section as well. I'm from Arecibo. I was born in Utuado, which is in the mountains, but Arecibo is just right north of Utuado. Arecibo is like 20 minutes away from Isabela. So it's right on the north coast. My middle school actually was right next to the beach. From my classroom, through the windows, I feel the breeze of the beach, and it was amazing. So I am very well connected with that area. That was another thing, though, because it was also comfortable, too. Inside that library of that particular school, I remember feeling like we didn't need air conditioning. And we're talking about Puerto Rico. This is like 90, 95-degree weather all the time. You open the windows and you feel the breeze coming from the beach. And it was so comfortable and, like I said, safe space. I truly, truly believe that oftentimes we underestimate the value that libraries have in our lives. And as I was approaching this conversation, I was saying, wow, some of the things that I didn't know were happening to me. Now in retrospective, I'm actually going back and be like, wait a second, that's how libraries were impactful in my life. Because I didn't know that that was a space for me where I was safe and where I was learning and where I was growing that curiosity and that creative side of me. I didn't know because I didn't go to the libraries for that purpose. I went to the libraries because it was a safest space for me to be at and for me to hide away from the rest of the environment that I didn't feel like I fit. But at the same time, now in retrospective, I'm looking back and I'm like, it wasn't just that. There was work in progress happening in my life as I was going through the library. And now with that information, I can impart that information to others and say, listen, when you come to the library, this is not just for you to have just a quiet, safe space, which it is, but it's also the place where your imagination, your creativity, all of this learning that oftentimes you don't get from your normal circle, this is where it grows. This is where it comes from. Libraries are extremely important for preserving history. And this is preserving history, and this is extremely important. I oftentimes go back to folks and people that lived in other areas that I didn't get to live to learn about them. And history, it's to me so valuable, and libraries take a huge part on this. So when you talk about the family that I had here in Connecticut, these are all educators. So when I came to Connecticut, I already had a little bit of English. I lived in Philadelphia for a few years during my high school. But then I went back to Puerto Rico. And, when you don't speak the language often, you kind of start losing it again. So when I came to Connecticut, my English, it needed help. And not only that, I came to work at the school district as a paraprofessional 18, 19 years ago. And when I did that, I understood that improving my language skills were extremely important. So I had educators in my family, but I also was working at the school. So I had like the perfect storm around me to really help me to learn the language and educate myself, not only in the language, but also in the culture. And how do I fit in the community? What's my role in society? So working at the school district, inside a school that had a library, that had all these amazing books that I was able to tap into. Every time I had any doubts or I needed resources to understand why things are the way they are, it was easily accessible to me. So even as an adult, libraries still play a huge role. And I say that because I'm extremely curious. I like to know why things are the way they are. And that's why you have to go back to the history. You have to go back of why is this law the way that it is? Or why do people do this? Or why do we celebrate these? All these questions that may sound as simple, minor questions, they were extremely important to me because I was just learning a new culture. I was learning as an adult now, how do I fit in this community? And I needed to understand all these little simple questions that sometimes we take for granted. And it was extremely important for me to tap into the resources that I had around me, not only the educators, but also all the books that had all the information that I needed. When you say something is 250 years old, the first thing you think about is consistency. This must be a great place. Nothing lasts 250 years unless it's great. So imagine if a library can last 250 years. Now you start thinking about how much history, how much archives must be leaving this place. And now you are basically telling me, hey, Amilcar, you better go and find out where those archives are and start reading because there's probably a lot of treasures in there that will be very interesting to me, right? So it does spark a little bit more curiosity. But when something lasts this long, it's just equivalent to excellence. There's just no other way to describe it. So 250 years of Hartford Public Library equals excellence. Well, we're in 2024, so we have to have this conversation. Because 10 years old right now, for the most part, I'm not saying all of them, if you say, I will encourage you to go to the library to read this book and learn about this, whatever that is, right? Even if it's a topic of interest. Or you could just go online and Google it and then just read it from whatever website comes up with that information. You know what that young person is going to choose most likely. That person is going to stay at the comfort of their home, open up the iPad or whatever device they use, and then read it online. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of valuable information online. I mean, we all use it, but they will be missing something key, something very valuable about being inside a library. It's the environment. Nothing beats the environment of a library. When you're walking into a library, your mindset, your psychology, the way you feel, it automatically changes. I would say 9 out of 10 people automatically lower their voices. And you have a certain level of respect for the place. Libraries are just like that. You walk into a library and you automatically feel that you're coming into a place where people are there to learn. People are there to find a safe space. People are there because they want to know more. They want to learn. They want to grow. And they are there for a reason. Nobody goes into a library just to walk around and then come outside. They go to a library because they have a purpose. There's a purpose inside a library. So to a 10-year-old, I would say, walk into a library with your parents, with your brothers, siblings, whoever. Walk into a library. Take a walk around all the different departments, all the different areas of the library. Then sit down for a second and write down your first thought about the library. I hope that you speak about how you felt about walking around the library. What were some of those things that you thought about? Because I hope that some of those thoughts will take you to start to think about the value of that. I would say that some of the first thought is, it was quiet. A lot of books. A lot of different words that I didn't know what they meant. But those are the things that will spark that curiosity. And I don't think that oftentimes when you're online, you get that opportunity because when you go online, you go and search for something specifically and you get the answer and then you're done. And it is a very equitable approach. You go in and you have the ability to choose whatever book you want from whatever category you want. Nobody's going to tell you yes or no. Nobody's going to say, no, you cannot do that. Library is open. And 100% of the access that you have to the library is within your reach. When you walk across the library, there's so many interesting things that you didn't even think they exist. But as you are searching, as you're walking around, you're going to see things that you're going to be like, wait a second, I know I came here for this particular thing, but let me take a few minutes to check this out real quick. It's exposing you to a whole world out there that you didn't even know existed. So oftentimes when I think about youth development and some of the at-risk youth that we have in our community, sometimes I take the approach of having this conversation backwards. Oftentimes, we start having this conversation with our young people about the issues that they're having right in the moment, and that's important because you have to address those issues that are immediate to them, those issues that are in their forefront. That's extremely important. Oftentimes, if you don't work with those barriers and challenges that they have in front of you, they won't see beyond that. So you have to handle that. But once you get to that point where you could have a more broader conversation about goals, about what the future looks like, I like to have a conversation backwards. I start having the conversation, where do you see yourself when you become 40 years old, 50 years old? I want to push them to that level, which is oftentimes, we're talking about 20, 30 years later. I'm not asking them where you plan to be when you're 25 or 30 years old. That's a little bit too close, right? 16, 17, okay, in 5, 10 years, this is what I think I'll be doing. Where do you see yourself when you become 40 and 50? Because oftentimes they don't think and they don't remember that they're going to become 40 and 50 at some point. And that's a very difficult question for them to answer. But when you have those conversations, it pushes them to be like, well, at that age, I really want to have a big house. They start having a conversation that normally they wouldn't have when you tell them, where do you plan to be when you become 25 and 30? Because at that age, they're still thinking that they're still kind of figuring out, maybe starting a family, maybe not. That's not a priority during that time frame. But when you push them to think about where they're going to be in the 40, 50-year range, you push them to have that conversation. And then you work backwards. Okay, so if you want to have a family, you want to have a big house, you want to be in this particular community, and you want to have all these things that you're mentioning to me, so how do we get there? And then you bring them down back to, what are you going to do now to get there? Because we're already determined that this is what you want when you are 40 and 50 years old. Now you set that framework. You push them, you challenge them to work towards that. So libraries in this particular conversation, it's a great opportunity not only to have these conversations because it's a safe space, it's a space where their mindset is different. It's a space where I feel like teenagers and young people, they are more open to think deeper, to go beyond just the regular answer that they will give you if you were just talking to them informally on the street. It pushes them because now they know they're at a different level. A library is just a different level. And not only that, you also have the resources of showing them, listen, you want to have this, you want to have that. Let me show you what some of the folks that have done this before us, let me show you how they did it. Let me show you how far they got. So you can connect the two, the conversation and tangible examples. And sometimes that sinks in because a lot of our young people, they are very visual. You show them a picture, you show them something, and for them, they won't forget about that. They may forget about some of the conversation, but they won't forget about a visual that you show them. And I think the library has plenty of that to show. Oftentimes we do underestimate the importance of failures. I grew up in Puerto Rico and then part of it in Philadelphia with a lot of drugs around me. Family members. I didn't grow up with my mom or my dad. My aunt has to raise me because of these other social issues. And to me, I always felt that I was a failure because I couldn't have the same that my other friends had. I couldn't have the mom and dad in the house. I couldn't have some of the financial capacity to even buy a ticket to go to the movies. And sometimes we take that for granted because back then in the 90s, $3 or $4 or $5, you could go to the movie theater. And you would think, oh, that should have been easy. It was extremely hard for me to have that financial capacity. So I always felt as a failure on that end. However, in academics, I was always very successful. And I kept that consistency all throughout high school and throughout college. But those failures, they pushed me to grow, to mature much earlier than normal. It pushed me to do something for myself because I didn't want to continue living under this bubble that I created for myself that I always thought that I was a failure. In retrospective, I know I wasn't a failure. But during that time, at the capacity of an 8, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old kid, I felt that I was a failure. I was good at sports. I was good academically. But that wasn't enough for me because my household was not stable. And for me, it was important that I look back as I kept growing and look back to all those challenges that I had to get through in order for me to learn and to grow. I was very conservative every time I speak to people. I was very professional, very respectful, because I felt that that was the way for me to change my environment, to change the course of my life. Otherwise, I knew I was going to just live in that vicious cycle. And I needed to get away from that cycle. And for me to do that, I had to be different. But I learned that because of all this failure mentality that I had. And to me, that was extremely important. Success, it just kept pushing me to continue being successful. But the one thing that triggered me to start being successful to begin with was the fact that I just didn't want to feel that I was a failure anymore. From a government perspective, I would say there are two things that are extremely important. These are the two top priorities. And not to say that there aren't other areas that are as important. But in this particular conversation, there's public safety and education. So when we look at education, it's extremely important. Oftentimes, you talk to some folks that don't have any more kids, that the kids already are out of their homes. And I can understand that for them, perhaps there are other areas of our community, our society that are of more importance because it affects them more directly than promoting early childhood or promoting financial literacy or promoting more investment in libraries because they don't directly necessarily use these services, right? And that's normal because we all have our own different needs. But my question to the whole community is, what happens if we don't invest more in education? What happens if this 2-3-year-old that's ready to go to an early childhood center to start learning at the early age, what happens if we don't have enough funding for early childhood? By the time that kid is in 2nd or 3rd grade, he's going to be 1 or 2 grades behind in literacy, in math. And by the time that kid gets to 6th grade, that kid is going to be 3 grades behind in literacy, in math, in science. And then by the time that kid graduates from high school, oftentimes we've seen kids graduating from high school that their reading level is at the 7th, 8th grade level. So now you have community members of your same community that are now being challenged to work and to contribute to society without the tools necessary because we failed to invest in their education, because we failed to provide them with the resources, because we failed to invest in libraries, because we failed to attack the problem from the root. And that's one way that I connect government with my community, education, libraries. That's how important libraries and education are to our community. If we don't invest in those 2 areas as early as birth, we are not going to be able to build that cradle to career path that we've always dreamed of having in our community. Oftentimes, libraries are in one particular place. And yes, we may have a mobile library that could go around, right? But perhaps we may have to think about changing a little bit the target population. See, oftentimes the target population is children and youth, which is extremely important. That should be our target population. That's where that curiosity and creativity, we need to encourage that. But when you ask me the question about the society, the community as a whole, perhaps we have to go to this next target population, which are other folks from our community that don't necessarily are connected with the education or with the library, and then bring the library to them and show them how important it is. It's all about education. They are not necessarily going to come volunteer to come to the library unless the library is having events that target that population. But if the library becomes more than just the typical traditional place where you come to get a book and read it, we will be able to open the doors for so much more vibrancy, so much more buy-in from the community. And I think that this library in particular has done a great job at that. I think for me, having this opportunity of having this conversation, it really put things in perspective. Like I mentioned earlier, I didn't know how important libraries were to me or to my life until I was approached to have this conversation, because it really made me peel those layers of what a library did to my life in different times of my life, the impact that it had. We may have to do this more often, not just with leaders of the community, just with our community. Let's have them give a little bit more thought into what a library means to them. I think that's just a simple but such a deep question, because right now I didn't know how important it was until I was having this conversation. I assure you that there are thousands of our residents out there that are in the same boat that I was, that we couldn't make the connection between the library and how impactful it has been in our lives. I'm happy to be part of this, more importantly, not because of whether it's going to live in the archives for hundreds of years to come, but because what it just did to my life. It made me realize and understand something that was deep inside me that I never peeled those layers of. So this was more of me giving my time to have this conversation. It was more about me learning about myself and how important libraries have been in my life. So I appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to 250 Stories, a production of HPL Studios at Hartford Public Library. This episode was written and produced by Christopher T. Brown, sound by Sam Sigmund, edited by Faith Lucas, and with photography and graphic design support from Hartford Public Library's communications team and the Hartford History Center. For more information on this project, visit www.hplstudios.hplct.org. New episodes release every Tuesday, so subscribe to stay tuned.